Desde a Segunda Guerra Mundial não se via algo assim. Uma grande metrópole em ruínas, uma zona de guerra no coração da maior potência do planeta. Mas o inimigo que destruiu Detroit, a capital da indústria automobilística americana, não é externo, é o próprio país. Esta cidade arrasada virou símbolo do declínio dos Estados Unidos. O país que fechou o século XX no auge do poder, da prosperidade e da glória, em poucos anos mergulhou numa espiral de decadência. O Sem Fronteiras ouviu especialistas para entender as causas dessa queda.
People have lost faith in the government here generally, and that's the federal government, but also local government. I think they've lost faith in the sort of cement that held America together. This idea that hard work was rewarded.
The American dream.
The American dream, but that hard work is rewarded, that if you play by the rules, you can succeed. If you do wrong, you will get punished, and you will be richer than your parents. Right? Those are kind of the basics.
O economista Max Wolf é professor da New School University em Nova York. Ele ressalta que pela primeira vez na história dos Estados Unidos, a nova geração está levando uma vida pior que a da geração anterior.
Now a lot of people think if you work hard and do what you're supposed to, you're a sucker, that you will get rich if you're rich or connected, and that basically the society isn't fair, and that they don't have a good chance, and the fear is that their kids will be poorer than them. And that's a very dramatic turn in how Americans see themselves and America and their place in the world.
There's, I think, increasing agreement among economists and political scientists that for a country to prosper economically over the long run, it's important that the majority of its population be well educated and also share in the country's prosperity and contribute to the country's prosperity. And that's less and less true in the United States. This is the first generation in the United States where this generation will be less educated and less prosperous than its parents' generation. And education now is becoming much more expensive, much less available. Public education no longer receives the funding that it used to. And as a result, there are now increasingly two educational systems in the United States, one for the wealthy and another for everybody else.
So the American story of education and infrastructure is increasingly also a story of divergence or inequality. We have some excellent schools, some schools that folks all over the world want to come to, right? Whether those are junior high schools or colleges, for sure. But we have underfunded chronically public education. I'll give you an example. We have fired, net, about 350,000 teachers since the downturn because of state and city budget problems. I mean, across the whole country, right? Not New York.
That's
the whole country. It's a lot, right? So more than 250,000 teachers and teachers' aides, folks working in the schools, not just teachers, have lost their jobs. We actually have more kids in school, though, than we had 6 years ago, right? So where's the commitment to education? For a country as wealthy and dynamic as America, why are we never in the top 10 or 15 for educational categories? And why don't we care? I mean, when we're not number one for global stock market performance, everybody talks about it and we commit to it and we fix it. Our infrastructure is an international source of shame. It stinks, right? We have a third world infrastructure, except for that many places in the developing world have better infrastructure than us. So the group
like
of
China, for instance.
China for sure, but even less wealthy, dynamic, developing countries, right? So, I mean, just to give you an idea, the civil engineers of America have a society, and they rank our infrastructure. Every year now, we've been less than a C. Right now, we're at a D, right, between a D and an F. And the best estimates are between 1 and 2 trillion, and 2,000 billion US dollars would be required to fix our infrastructure.
If you travel around the United States, you'll see that actually a lot of people in America are poor, really poor. And you know, if you look at the level of political discourse in the United States, you'll see that it doesn't reflect the kind of political debate that you see in an educated, optimistic, prosperous country. And it's very sad and it's very alarming. And then, of course, you see things like the level of indebtedness of young people, particularly people who borrow money to go to university. And it's very troubling to see what's happening to the United States now. And when you talk to young people, you know, you see it. You see a sense of cynicism and fatalism and pessimism about their own prospects and about politics and participating in the political system and so on.
Share prices continued to tumble.
Lehman Brothers was forced to declare itself
O
bankrupt.
cineasta e cientista político Charles Ferguson, que ganhou o Oscar de melhor documentário pelo filme Inside Job, publicou um livro, O Sequestro da América, onde analisa as causas do declínio do país. Ele aponta a desigualdade como principal fator.
The top 1%, what happened to the top 1%?
The incomes and wealth of the top 1% have gone up dramatically, and that increase has been even more dramatic for the top 0.1%. That's perhaps the most striking thing about the United States, is that now for the first time since really the late 19th century, for the first time in a very long time, certainly the first time in 100 years, we now have a situation where a small number of people, maybe 20 or 30,000 people in the United States, have a substantial fraction of the total wealth that America has.
More than 20%, right?
Yes.
And growing.
Yes.
And what is happening to the 99%?
About half of the American population is kind of more or less staying in the same place. But what I find most disturbing, actually, is that a very significant fraction of the American population, a quarter, a third, big fraction, a lot of people are now experiencing downward mobility and reduced opportunity. And that is beginning to cause some really serious problems. And one of them, for example, is that most Americans don't know this and probably would be quite shocked if they were to hear it. But now Americans who do not have a high school diploma, which is still a significant number of people, Americans who do not have a high school diploma have declining life expectancy, and actually rather significantly declining life expectancy. And that's a terrible thing, That the first symptoms of that decline actually started in the 1970s with the internal decline of a number of American industries and companies, the automobile industry, for example, the steel industry, the consumer electronics industry, and also with America's troubled, incomplete, difficult response to the rise of OPEC and the oil embargoes and the need to begin changing energy policy.
Congratulate you, sir.
And then starting in the 1980s with the election of Ronald Reagan, the progressive deregulation of American industry and the fact that deregulation allowed several industries to become very concentrated and very predatory and gave them increasing political power, gradually turned the United States into a place where the very wealthy do extremely well and most of the rest of the country does not.
Detroit is emblematic of the industrial decline of America, right? So the United States is one of the few countries that is literally willing to throw away its cities, right? At least large portions of many of its cities. So there are Camdens and St. Louis's and Detroits and Clevelands. Detroit's not the only one, but it's very dramatic. So you go through Detroit and you look at a city that was once 2 million people, that's now 500,000 people. That was once literally the pounding heart of American industry and is now permanently on life support.
Nada representa tão bem a ascensão e a queda vertiginosa de Detroit quanto essa estação de estrada de ferro, a Central de Michigan. Por aqui chegavam todos os dias milhares de trabalhadores para as fábricas de automóveis. Era o orgulho da cidade, do estado e da nação. Hoje, esta ruína que a cidade não tem dinheiro para mandar demolir, cercada de arame farpado para impedir que os vândalos levem o pouco que restou. O último trem partiu daqui em 1988. Desde então, a estação está fechada. Antes que as cercas fossem erguidas há poucos anos, uma equipe de TV conseguiu entrar e mostrar os salões majestosos, arruinados e cobertos de grafite. Detroit está cheia de prédios assim, que já foram arranha-céus, hoje não passam de esqueletos condenados. São 70 mil imóveis abandonados. A impressão é de uma cidade bombardeada, ou vítima de um furacão ou terremoto. Mas o desastre é econômico e social, e cultural também. Afinal, Detroit já foi um dos principais centros da cultura popular do país. Durante 75 anos, este foi um dos maiores teatros e cinemas dos Estados Unidos. Carmen Miranda se apresentou naquele palco. Hoje está essa ruína. E não pode ser demolido, porque o prédio ao lado, que ainda é usado, viria abaixo. O Teatro Fantasma acabou como estacionamento de automóveis. Parece cenário de filme de vampiro ou do Fantasma da Ópera. Relíquia abandonada de um tempo em que saíam de Detroit para o mundo os sons do jazz e da música soul, os tempos da gravadora Motown, de Diana Ross e as Supremes, os Jackson 5 com o pequeno Michael Jackson. Tudo isso acabou. A indústria automobilística fechou as fábricas e se mudou para outros lugares. A população acabou reduzida a menos de 500 mil habitantes, um quarto do que era no auge de Detroit. São, na maioria, negros, 88% da população. Nos abrigos, dormem 20 mil pessoas sem teto. Um número maior, desconhecido, vive entre as ruínas. Há mendigos nas esquinas, o que é raro em cidades americanas. O desemprego e a criminalidade são os mais altos do país. O índice de homicídios é 10 vezes maior que o de Nova York. A cidade teve que declarar falência no ano passado por não conseguir pagar as dívidas. A primeira grande cidade americana a falir. O sociólogo David Fazenfest diz que Detroit foi vítima de um ataque dos interesses privados contra o poder público e os sindicatos.
The union movement has been suffering for the last 2 to 3 decades. With the decline of manufacturing, which is where the unions were strongest, membership has declined. I mentioned to you already, the automobile industry produces the same number of cars with 1/4 of the workers. Since, I think, the election of Obama, and even before, the whole union movement has been under assault, and what's left now are the teachers' unions and the public sector unions. SEIU is very strong, and one of the few unions that really were growing. And so there has been this sort of mantra of reducing the public sector, the federal public sector. But people have not been paying attention to the fact that the total government employees in the United States has shrunk a lot because it's been the local governments, the state governments that have been laying off people. If we want to talk about it in political terms, the mistake that liberals made is that they kept focusing on national politics. What the conservatives did was they worked very hard to win local elections, and so they have mayors, they have state legislatures, they have governors, and they're the ones that are making, this shrinking. Who gets hurt? The public sector has primarily been the bastion of jobs for women and minorities. So as the public sector shrinks, the services for the poorest vanishes or considerably reduced, and the employment of those people is in decline. And so the unions are now taking a hit. At the same time, a lot of states are passing what's called right-to-work laws or similar kinds of laws. Now with what they call right to work and other similar kinds of legislation, you don't have to belong to the union and you don't have to pay them. So it cuts into the union's resources. It hurts the union's ability to support workers. But in the case of Detroit, it's destroying what's left of even the remnants of a middle class because there are no jobs. And many people talk about Detroit as an example of white flight. And I think that's a mistake. What really is happening in Detroit is it's an example of economic flight.
Somewhere on the order of 1 in 3 physical structures in the city of Detroit is abandoned with no tax-paying owner of record. Right? So Detroit actually looks like something from a science fiction movie. It looks like a dystopian future world after some apocalypse. And it is the dystopian future world after the apocalypse that was the American middle class and the American heavy industry section. There has been a bit of a revitalization in some areas, and industry is beginning to come back in the United States, but not in Detroit.
Em 2009, a indústria automobilística foi salva da falência pelo governo Obama. E 5 anos depois voltou a crescer e a dar lucro, mas Detroit continua abandonada. É impressionante o contraste entre as torres das grandes empresas e a cidade destruída. Na Segunda Guerra Mundial, Detroit ganhou o nome de o arsenal da democracia. De fábricas como esta aqui, hoje em ruínas, saíram 6 milhões de fuzis, 3 milhões de tanques e caminhões e 27 mil aviões. Essa produção sem precedentes na história garantiu a vitória dos aliados. Detroit era o centro do império industrial dos Estados Unidos, que foi sucateado ao longo das últimas décadas. As grandes empresas americanas foram buscar mão de obra mais barata na Ásia e na América Latina. A globalização levou ao surgimento de novas potências. Os Estados Unidos ainda são a maior potência militar, mas a hegemonia americana está com os dias contados. É o que afirma um dos maiores críticos das aventuras militares americanas, Noam Chomsky, que recebeu Sem Fronteiras no Massachusetts Institute of Technology.
The American imperial system reached its peak in 1945. At that point, the end of the war, the United States was in a position of power that had absolutely no historical precedent. The U.S. had half the world's wealth. Other industrial societies had been devastated or severely weakened. The United States gained enormously during the war. Industrial production almost quadrupled. Depression was ended. The U.S. had an unbelievable security. It totally controlled the Western Hemisphere, controlled both oceans, controlled the opposite sides of both oceans. I mean, there was just nothing like it in history. The U.S. called a hemispheric conference even before the war ended, February 1945 in Mexico. And the goal of the conference was to enforce a charter of the Americas, which aimed quite explicitly to block economic nationalism in all its forms. That was 1945. The decline of the system began immediately. One serious blow was in 1949. China declared independence. It was assumed that China would be a core part of the U.S. system. Immediately, U.S. planners around 1950 began to be concerned about loss of Indochina, and therefore the U.S. shifted policy and began to support the French effort to reconquer their former colony. That goes on to the Indochina Wars, which are the worst crime of the post-war period, 20th century. Horrible crimes. Indochina is virtually destroyed, millions of people killed. Then comes the problems elsewhere.
64 in Brazil.
64 in Brazil. U.S. basically planned the coup. It took place right after Kennedy's assassination, but they were actually involved in the planning. That was described, as you may recall, by the U.S. ambassador, Lincoln Gordon, as the greatest achievement for freedom in the late 20th century. And it goes on country after country. Chile, Argentina, Central American crimes, everywhere. But meanwhile, the American empire has been declining. When the so-called Arab Spring began, there was terror here that the U.S. might lose the Middle East. When there's a dictator, your favorite dictator, who's in trouble, what you do is support him till the very end. When it becomes impossible to support him, maybe because the army turns against him or the business classes turn against him, then send him off somewhere, issue ringing declarations about your love of democracy, and try to restore the old system. There's case after case. Marcos in the Philippines, Somoza in Nicaragua, Duvalier in Haiti, Ceausescu actually was another case. The U.S. supported him in Romania to the last minute, Mobutu, on, and that's exactly what they did. They tried to support Mubarak as long as possible, and it finally literally became impossible. The Iraq invasion is a textbook example of aggression. The U.S. and Britain, secondarily, are responsible for inflaming a Sunni-Shia conflict which did not exist before. It developed during the occupation. It's now consuming the whole region. We're responsible. We are responsible for all the evil that follows.
Será este o ocaso do Império Americano ou apenas uma fase de recuo estratégico? Será possível reverter a profunda desigualdade que cria uma Detroit de pobreza e atraso dentro de cada cidade dos Estados Unidos? O sonho americano acabou ou ainda pode renascer?
We built a big middle class, we built a very successful economy, still a wealthy, powerful country. Could we turn this around? Yes. Is there any sign that we're going to? No. Are we doing it now? Absolutely not. But there's a growing awareness of this as a problem, and my guess is that's necessary but not sufficient for change.
The U.S. is being forced to retreat, as has been happening since 1949. Case after case. South America, in fact, is a dramatic case. The U.S. isn't retreating from South America, it's being forced out. Military bases are basically gone, not entirely. The last official one was in Ecuador, and the U.S. tried to keep it and was kicked out. Actually, Correa made the interesting comment that the United States can keep the Manta base in Ecuador if Ecuador can keep a base in Florida. That's a tremendous change in world affairs. In the Middle East, what's happening? Obama simply does not have the power and the force to do the kinds of things the U.S. did in the past.
Even though there's all this obvious decline, there are areas like technology or even energy, because now the U.S. is the biggest producer of energy, that could maybe revert that process?
Well, there are certainly parts of the United States and parts of the American economy that are still doing very well, and technology, for sure, is one of them. And indeed, I think if it weren't for the information technology sector, the United States overall would be in much worse condition than it is. And I love the technology sector. I was in it for a while, and I grew up close to Silicon Valley. I still live in Northern California. And I know a lot of those people, and I'm very glad that the sector exists, but it isn't enough to compensate for the rest of what's happening to the United States. I do hope that at some point the American people will get angry enough and activist enough to do something about this situation that has happened before in American history. There have been protest movements before that have been successful in getting major things changed. And I hope that happens again. I think it will take a while. I don't think it's going to happen soon.